We're very happy to have another installment of the Global Transitions Conference, this time on a very hot topic of economic statecraft. And we are happy that this year, again, we have some of the top scholars who are working on this theme. They have made major contributions to this debate. We have representation from international institutions, research institutes and universities, of course, so the academic community. We also have major think tanks participating, so for example, Chatham House or GPPI and others. We have practitioners, influential practitioners present amongst us to help us keep our feet on the ground, to ask the tough questions about ground reality. It's very easy for us to come up with theories, but will the theories work? Will they be useful? Will our models be useful? And so we have colleagues from NDR representing the media. We have colleagues from the World Trade Organization, from the Federal Foreign Office. So we're very excited about having this interdisciplinary exchange, but also an exchange between the worlds of policy and academia. So, as you know, there is a very rich, vibrant debate on the question of geoeconomics, economic statecraft. And this debate has become even richer, even more vibrant, ever since Henry Farrell and Abe Newman came out with their paper on weaponized interdependence. So we wanted to study these issues, but we wanted to make sure that we don't just reinvent the wheel. We wanted to bring some real value added to the debate. And we thought we could do this in three ways by organizing this conference and focusing on three important themes. So first, we are the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. So one of our expertise lies in the regions of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And we want to bring the regions into the debate. So how are the regions using economic statecraft proactively? And perhaps equally important, are they only victims of the weaponization of interdependence, or are they able to retaliate? Are they able to use this? How do they work in a world of weaponized interdependence, which is something quite specific, or economic statecraft more broadly? So both as users of economic statecraft or geoeconomics, but also as how they defend themselves against this. The second important value added that we hope to bring from this conference is on the role of institutions, both multilateral and regional institutions, because the post-war order that was set up and the institutions that were set up in the post-war era, post-Second World War era, were really not designed for a world where you have the weaponization of economics or the weaponization of interdependence. So it's a tough question. What is it that the institutions can do to help regulate against this? Can they do anything? Can they be reformed? Can they be updated? Institutions like the World Trade Organization or the European Union, for example. And then the third value added that we hope to bring is we also want to have a discussion on the concept of the weaponization of interdependence, which is a part of the discussion of economic statecraft. But what are other forms of the uses of economic statecraft? How does weaponized interdependence differ from other instruments, other models that are available? So that's the kind of debate we're hoping to have at the GIGA as part of our annual conference on global transitions focused on economic statecraft.
So this is just one aspect of economic statecraft, which is what Abe and I describe as weaponized interdependence. And the idea here is that we are looking at how entire networks, the networks that hold the global economy together, have been turned into tools of strategic surveillance and coercion by major states such as the United States of America. And what has changed is that this would have been impossible 30 or 40 years ago, when you simply did not have these global networks playing anything like the role that they have at the moment. So now we have a world in which all of the different countries depend upon global networks for their economies to work, for their communication systems to work, and so weiter. And so that means that it is necessary for these economies to have access to these networks. And if a powerful state is able to deny them access, this can have serious economic consequences. So that is what has changed. So these are two different effects that you could imagine to have with state control of the central points of a network. So the Panopticon effect is about how if you have control of the central parts of a network, the nodes through which much of the data flows, you are then able to see what that data is, and you're able to understand it. And in a sense, you are able to monitor the entire network, just as in Jeremy Bentham's imaginary prison, the Panopticon, it was possible to see all of the prisoners from a single central point. You were able to do the same for the entire network. So you were able to turn, for example, as the NSA was able to do, you were able to turn the internet into a vast distributed machinery of surveillance. And the choke point effect is different. That is when you deny access to a network. And so, for example, here the United States was able to use its control of the SWIFT network and the dollar clearing system to deny Iran real access to the global financial system, which had huge consequences for Iran's economy. Well, we are trying to figure out, now that we are in a world where other states understand that this is happening, how are they going to respond? Are they going to respond by trying to create their own networks? Are they going to try to respond by insulating themselves? Are they going to try to respond by retaliating against the United States or other countries? Or simply are they just going to hide and pretend that nothing is happening? So we are now in a world where interesting things are beginning to happen in the global economy. We used to think that we had a standard story about how globalization worked, that effectively when we saw global markets being created and these global networks, they would integrate and unite countries together and create peace and subject the state to market forces, so that you did not have a world of geopolitics and geoeconomics anymore. Instead, you had a world where there would be peaceful coexistence between states all working together in the same market system. We are discovering that that is not true. We are discovering that the networks, the forms of intercommunication, that these are all becoming tools of coercion, tools of surveillance, and this is having profound consequences for world politics. So for the world, this is not a good thing. For scholars of international relations, it means that we now have something to really get our teeth in to try and understand what exactly is happening.
Great. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here in Hamburg. The paper, I think its central insight is to flip the conversation about globalization. For many years, there was a narrative, or a myth even, that globalization was always a win-win activity. And so by creating global economic networks, that would really weaken the role that states could play in statecraft. And what our paper does is it first shows that many economic networks are not flat and decentralized, but they have points of centralization in them. And that second, that states have woken up to this possibility and that they're using those centralized nodes for coercive ends. And I think that that's causing many policymakers and also business people to rethink the political risk involved in globalization. Yeah, so I think our advice for policymakers are first to recognize that this is a new type of coercion, and just like other forms of coercion, whether that's restricting market access or threatening military action, that there needs to be a set of rules of the road around when to use them. Because the risk is if you start to employ these, what we call willy-nilly, just to every problem, that you could see unintended consequences, and that might be be escalation, miscalculation, overreaction, and all of those things, I think, could really have detrimental consequences for the global economy, but also security consequences. Sure. So I think in the short term, many of these key global economic networks are difficult to evade because they do have these kinds of oligopolistic or monopoly roles in the global economy. And so in those situations, states are willing to keep using them, or actors are able to keep using them, even though they present vulnerabilities. But what we are interested in are also the dynamic consequences. So over time, what will happen to these networks? And one of the things we're seeing are targeted states are starting to develop alternative hubs or alternative networks that they can use to at least mask themselves from US or European coercion. And so, for example, the Russian and Turkish, they've had a cooperative structure set up for payments between the two economies. And for us, that's not going to challenge the US dollar globally, but it does create a dark space that those states can use in order to evade US power. Yes. So I think one of the key takeaways from our argument is not that we should end globalization. I think we are strong believers that there are tremendous welfare benefits to having a global economy, but we do want to make the argument that it's naive to think that those do not come with any security risks. And so the challenge for policymakers and businesses is to maintain continued economic contact, but also to build in redundancies, trust mechanisms in order to manage these new security risks at the same time.
Sure. In fact, this is the focus of my own presentation in the conference, and it's a part of a project that I'm doing, that I'm working on, that's led by Dan Dresna and Henry Farrell and Abe Newman on the weaponization of interdependence. And I'm looking at what can you do if you are small, if you're weak, if you're a part of the global South with not that much agency, if you don't sit on one of the economic hubs that allow for the weaponization of interdependence. And I will argue in my presentation that there are several strategies that are available, which range, on the one hand, to simply making the most of the trade war, for example. And so countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh have made some gains from the trade war that has been launched between the US and China. That's one example of what a small power can do. It can sit on a little bit on the sidelines and still make some gains because the elephants are fighting, and these smaller powers are not getting trampled on. But that's still a relatively passive strategy. When it becomes really interesting is what agency can they exercise? And that's where coalition building becomes very interesting and very important. So smaller powers can form coalitions amongst themselves, but also potentially parties that have the power to become hubs but are still not. So for example, one could see alliances forming between the European Union, India, Japan, and or coalitions, perhaps not alliances, but coalitions forming between these powers as they try and come up with alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And another thing that smaller powers can use is they can try and change the narrative. They can do this by getting engaged in international organizations and by making international organizations aware of the importance of addressing the question of how interdependence can be weaponized, about how trade liberalization and the gains of trade liberalization may in fact be used by systemic rivals to gain a security edge. And here small players, small powers can make a big difference because there are still international institutions in which they can work.
regarding economic statecraft, I think this is a very old concept. We're talking about how a country utilizes the financial and economic resources in order to extend political influence. I think the essence remains the same, despite what is going on the so-called great power competition between China and the United States. But what's the differences now and what is new is just in terms of methodology and what would be considering as an economic statecraft. So in the past, most of the economic statecraft we would consider would be international assistance, foreign aid, and these are very static things given from the developed countries to developing countries. But nowadays, I think since the 21st century, we see a power shift between the so-called North Hemisphere and the global South. And then somehow countries like China, for example, has also become a major source of foreign assistance provision as well. So that really, the nature and also the countries which practice economic statecraft has changed. Now, secondly, is also to do with the, I would consider, secondly, is also to do with the increasing international economic influence of the so-called global South as well. And most of those countries would like to see a much bigger voice in Washington consensus-led international institutions in order to project its voice and adding a weight in terms of voting powers. And again, they try to using its increasing economic influence to exert political influence on international multilateral institutions. So I think because of the nature of international order and because of the power shift between North and South somehow has changed, and that really led a fundamental shift in terms of economic statecraft. The reason why I've chosen that subject is because I would consider, given where we are now between Washington and Beijing, it's not about tariff and the trade war. Essentially, we are having a conflict between two different economic systems and two contested political ideologies. So when I come to China, and Communist Party always have a debate to what extent it would allow the market to determine the economic activities, and also to what extent the Chinese Communist Party should intervene the market. And China had that debate back to 1978, and the end result was 40 years of economic success. And now the Chinese economy is slowing down, and the country is now in a turning point and try to debate exactly what will be the role of the market and what will be the role of the party. Because in order to let the party to give up certain power to offer more autonomy to the market, and then that would allow party to have more confidence. But however, I don't really think the Communist Party has yet have that sufficient confidence to let the market alone to run and to determine the economic activity. So that's why I would consider, on the one hand, yes, the Chinese Communist Party does need to have the market and economic growth to justify its legitimacy. But while on the other hand, the market could also change the party. So that's why I would consider that's a permanent dilemma.
So something definitely has changed. I think we're still wrestling with what exactly the concept of economic statecraft is. Mm-hmm. But certainly we're seeing countries implement policy tools in ways that are going to affect economic outcomes. So obviously during the trade war, that's manifests itself most clearly in the tariffs and the counter tariffs that the Trump administration and China are lobbying back and forth against one another. But it's through different policy tools as well. It's export controls, the restrictions on the ability to allow perhaps your competitors access to certain technologies that they might need to be able to produce goods and services for their own market or for around the world. It's showing up through restrictions on foreign investment, allowing companies from other countries into your market to even create factories and potentially create jobs. So there's lots and lots of different ways through this economic statecraft is being implemented, but I think it's still quite early to say how it's ultimately going to play out. Yeah, so the first 2 years of the trade war, and that's basically where we are as of the moment, is mainly focused on China. The Trump administration has rolled out tariffs, new tariffs, hitting about 2/3 of China's exports into the United States, a bit more than that. There's the possibility that another round of tariffs could come on December 15th. Those haven't been ruled out yet. We're getting close to a decision point there. But the main story, obviously, is this is challenging 15, 20 years, 30 years of integration of China into the global economy. There's a lot of talk about this issue of, is this a potential sign of decoupling of the two economies? That's obviously very, very difficult to do. But I think we're already seeing businesses, for example, take that possibility into consideration in the decisions that they have to make about where they have to place their supply chains, new investments that they're going to make, what markets they want to serve, where they want to set up their production. They're now thinking that this may be the new normal, these tensions between the United States and China, perhaps more broadly China and other countries of the West as well. And that's going to have major repercussions and ripple effects, I think, for a very long period of time.
We are in a world of competition right now. As was said earlier in the conference, the European Union has multilateralism in its DNA, and so it seeks to cooperate with either other member states of the Union or actually other political regional entities. Right now, the world is facing a United States that wants to decouple part of its interest from Europe. We have a revisionist Russia and a more assertive China on the world stage. That all of these new changes are impacting the European Union, and the European Union needs to think about how it changes its game, how it ups its game in a way. And that means using tools that are already at its disposal, and so it has massive economic power and the power of the single market, but it also means developing political will and a political power. And so that is being able to define its own interests, economic, political, geopolitical. The new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that she wanted this commission to be a geopolitical commission. So what does that mean? How does Europe define its own interests? How does it develop its strategic sovereignty? I think this is typically one of the issues that we're going to be talking about later today.
I think the rise of China and the decline or withdrawal of the US from a variety of multilateral global governance institutions has interestingly activated relations between different middle powers or regional powers. The European Union, India, Japan, a bit of Brazil, Australia. So it's interesting that it's in many ways a concern to see the US under President Trump withdrawing, the rise of China bringing up a new political philosophy reflecting its authoritarian system. But at the same time, it's also positive, I think, to see many of these other countries and regional powers coming together and trying to develop alternatives. And they are mostly democracies. So there is hope, therefore, for sort of more democratic institutions and governance of public goods. I'm thinking of data, for example, and data governance, which is a fundamental issue relating to political philosophy of human rights, civic rights, individual rights. Yeah, to counter China is a bit of a strong expression I've used, I think, in one of my titles of my pieces, but it's more about developing alternatives. It is the most formidable economic rise, the story of China worldwide. It's taken a record number of people out of absolute poverty, but it is a centralized, single-party political system. And what I'm seeing a lot in India is that in India you're developing alternatives now on connectivity, on capacity building, on technical assistance to many countries that are wanting to see more of India, more of Japan, more of the EU, to increase their bargaining power to China and to the US in many ways. So again, I see the emergence of a network of middle powers democratic middle powers in particular, that are developing alternative connectivity and interdependence approaches to the world beyond the US and China. Yeah, so I think it's almost a puzzle of why Europe and India didn't work together more until the 1990s, when they really started converging strategically and economically. But again, fortunately, because of the rise of China and the decline of the US in many ways, it's brought India and the EU at least together to talk about certain important, issues on governance and global governance. So, after a tough phase between 2010 and 14, 15, India and EU have restarted their annual summits for their strategic partnership, and they've really expanded the range of issues they're talking about. Free trade, which is actually a bit of a sensitive issue on which India hasn't been very positive, is actually the least interesting story. I see a lot of interest again on data governance, for example, where India is looking at the EU and its framework for data governance, regulation, privacy concerns as a model in many ways. Also the issue of maritime security in the Indian Ocean region and helping third countries, island states to develop their own capacity in terms of navies, coast guards, multilateralism. So there's a larger interest between the EU and India to develop a global governance framework which is anchored in inclusive and, let's say, democratic multilateralism.